When Thomas opened the abandoned mill, he found a massive Shire horse standing guard over 25 dying foals. The leather bag on the giant saddle held a dead woman's final message. Please, before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The autumn morning broke cold and gray over the countryside, with mist clinging to the valleys like a shroud. Thomas Harrington, a farmer of 53 years, had lived his entire life in these hills, working the land his grandfather had once tended. His hands were calloused from decades of labor, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes still held the sharp clarity of a man who knew every inch of his property. That morning, as he walked toward the old abandoned mill at the edge of his land, something felt different. The air carried a tension he couldn't quite name, a heaviness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The mill had been closed for nearly 30 years, its great wooden wheel frozen in time, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a forgotten giant. Thomas rarely ventured near it anymore. The building held too many memories of his youth, of days spent exploring its dusty corridors with his brother before life had taken them in different directions. Now the structure stood alone, slowly surrendering to nature as ivy climbed its stone walls and moss covered its roof tiles. But today, something had drawn him there. Perhaps it was the strange sound he'd heard the night before, a distant cry that had woken him from sleep and left him restless until dawn. As Thomas approached the mill, the sound came again. It was faint at first, barely audible over the whisper of wind through the bare branches of nearby trees. He stopped, tilting his head to listen more carefully. There it was again, clearer this time. A whinny, not just one but several overlapping in a chorus of distress that made his chest tighten with concern. Horses. But what would horses be doing in an abandoned mill? His property had no horses. None of his neighbors kept horses anymore, not since the farm work had been taken over by tractors and modern machinery. Thomas quickened his pace, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the mill's main entrance. The heavy wooden door hung slightly ajar, one of its hinges broken and rusted. He pushed it open carefully, the ancient wood groaning in protest. The sound that met him was overwhelming. Inside the cavernous space of the mill, illuminated by shafts of pale morning light that streamed through holes in the roof, stood what could only be described as a giant, a massive draft horse easily 18 hands high, with a coat the color of storm clouds and white feathering around its enormous hooves. The creature's presence dominated the space, making even the mill's high ceiling seem almost too low. But it wasn't the size of the horse that made Thomas freeze in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. It was what surrounded the giant. Foals. Dozens of them, their small bodies pressed together for warmth, their large eyes reflecting fear and exhaustion. Thomas counted quickly, his farmer's eye accustomed to tallying livestock. 25 foals, none of them appearing older than a few months, all showing signs of neglect. Their ribs were visible beneath dull coats, their legs trembled with weakness, and several lay on the ground too exhausted to stand. The giant horse stood in the center of them like a guardian, its noble head held high despite the obvious strain in its body. Thomas stepped forward slowly, speaking in the low, gentle voice he had always used with animals. The giant horse's ears swiveled toward him, alert but not aggressive. As he moved closer, Thomas noticed something else that sent a chill down his spine. The horse wore a saddle, not just any saddle, but an elaborate one made of fine leather, now cracked and dusty from neglect. It was the kind of saddle that spoke of wealth and prestige, completely at odds with the desperate scene before him. Hanging from the saddle, secured with a leather strap, was a saddlebag that looked as though it had been deliberately placed there for someone to find. The giant horse watched Thomas with intelligent eyes as he approached, making no move to flee or attack. Up close, the animal was even more impressive. Despite its obvious exhaustion and the signs of poor care, there was a dignity to the creature that took Thomas's breath away. This was no ordinary farm horse. This was a champion, a prize animal that had been bred and trained with care before whatever tragedy had brought it to this place. Thomas reached out slowly, allowing the horse to smell his hand before touching its neck. The animal's skin quivered beneath his palm, but it stood firm, trusting this stranger in a way that spoke of a gentle nature despite its massive size. With careful movements, Thomas unbuckled the saddlebag and lifted it free. It was heavier than he expected, and as he opened it, his hands began to shake. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwriting he would need better light to read. Beneath the journal were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be legal papers. But it was the envelope on top, sealed with red wax and marked with a single word in elegant script that made his heart race. The word was simply, "Please." Thomas looked from the envelope to the giant horse, then to the circle of foals that depended on this magnificent creature for protection. Whatever story these items held, whatever had brought this desperate family to his abandoned mill, he knew in that moment that his life was about to change forever. Thomas carried the saddlebag outside into the morning light, his mind racing with questions. The giant horse followed him to the doorway, unwilling to leave the foals, but clearly interested in what this human would do with the items it had carried for who knew how long. Thomas sat on an old stone wall that bordered the mill, the same wall where he had sat as a boy watching his father inspect equipment. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal on the envelope. The paper inside was expensive, the kind used for important documents, and the handwriting was elegant yet hurried, as though written in desperation. The letter began without preamble. "My name is Catherine Blackwood, and if you are reading this, then my beloved Goliath has found someone with a kind heart. I am writing this in what may be my final hours, and I have no one else to turn to. Goliath is not just a horse. He is a Shire, one of the finest examples of his breed, descended from champions that once pulled carriages for royalty. But more than his pedigree, he is a soul of pure goodness, and he has become the guardian of these 25 foals, through circumstances I can barely bring myself to explain." Thomas looked up from the letter, his eyes finding the massive horse still standing in the doorway. Goliath. The name suited him perfectly. He returned to the letter, his heart already heavy with the sorrow he knew was coming. "I was a breeder," the letter continued, "though I hesitate to use that word now, as it implies I knew what I was doing. I inherited my father's estate and his breeding operation 5 years ago when he passed suddenly. I thought I could continue his work, thought I could maintain the standards he had set, but I was foolish and proud, and I made terrible decisions that I will regret for whatever time I have left." The letter went on to explain how Catherine had expanded too quickly, taking out loans she couldn't repay, accepting horses she couldn't properly care for, all in an attempt to prove herself worthy of her father's legacy. When the bank came to collect, when her creditors demanded payment, she had been forced to sell everything. The estate, the equipment, the horses. Everything except Goliath, who had been her father's favorite, and the foals that had been born in her last desperate year of operation. No one wanted to buy the foals. They were too young, too much work, and the market for draft horses had collapsed along with her dreams. Thomas felt his throat tighten as he read the next part. "The new owner of the property gave me 1 week to remove everything that remained. 1 week to find homes for 25 foals and Goliath. I tried everything. I contacted every rescue organization, every farm, every person I could think of, but no one would take them. No one wanted the responsibility. They told me the kindest thing would be to have them put down, to end their lives before they suffered more. But I couldn't do it. I looked into Goliath's eyes, and I couldn't do it. The letter explained how Catherine had loaded all 25 foals into trailers, making multiple trips, and had led Goliath on foot through back roads and across fields, searching for somewhere safe to leave them. She had been sick, the letter revealed, dying from an illness she had ignored too long while trying to save her failing business. She knew she had only days left, and she couldn't bear the thought of these innocent creatures being destroyed simply because she had failed them. So she had searched for an abandoned place, somewhere with shelter, somewhere people might eventually find them. I chose this mill because I could see your farmhouse in the distance, Catherine's letter continued. I watched from the hills for 2 days, and I saw you working your land with care and patience. I saw how you stopped to help a lamb that had wandered from your small flock. I saw kindness in you, and it is all I have to hope for now. I have left all the documents you will need. Goliath's registration papers, the foal's birth records, everything that proves ownership. I am signing them all over to whoever finds this letter. They are yours now, if you will have them. Thomas wiped his eyes roughly, not wanting to smear the ink on the pages. The letter was nearly finished. I have left what little money I have left in this bag, Catherine wrote. It is not much, perhaps enough to feed them for a few weeks if you are careful. I know I am asking the impossible. I know that 26 horses are a burden no stranger should have to bear. But I'm begging you, whoever you are, please don't let them die because of my failures. Goliath has carried these foals through everything. He has protected them, guided them, kept them together when they would have scattered in fear. He is their father in every way that matters, though he sired none of them. He is noble and true, and he deserves better than the fate my foolishness has brought him to. The letter ended with a simple signature and a date from 3 weeks prior. Below it was a postscript that made Thomas's vision blur with tears. If you are reading this, I am gone. But please know that my last thoughts will be of hope. Hope that Goliath found you. Hope that you will see what I saw in these beautiful creatures. Hope that my final act was not one of cruelty, but of trust in the goodness of strangers. Please forgive me for this burden. Please save them. Thomas sat in silence for a long moment, the letter trembling in his hands. 26 horses. The cost of feeding them alone would be staggering. His small farm was barely profitable as it was. His savings were modest. He was one man, alone, with no family to help him shoulder this impossible responsibility. Every practical bone in his body told him to call the authorities to let them handle this situation, to walk away before he was pulled under by the weight of someone else's tragedy. But then he looked at Goliath, standing guard over his unlikely family, and Thomas knew he could no more turn away from this than he could stop breathing. Thomas stood and walked back into the mill, his decision made even if his mind hadn't fully accepted the enormity of it. The foals scattered slightly at his approach, their fear evident in every trembling muscle. But Goliath stepped forward to meet him. The giant horse lowered his massive head, and Thomas reached up to stroke the white blaze that ran down his face. The animal's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to hold a question. "Will you help us?" Thomas found himself nodding, as if the horse could understand. "I will," he whispered. "I don't know how, but I will." The first order of business was water. Thomas could see that several of the foals were severely dehydrated, their eyes sunken and their coats dull. He hurried back to his farmhouse, his legs carrying him faster than they had moved in years. His small barn had water troughs, but nothing large enough for this many animals. He grabbed every bucket he owned, filling them from the pump and loading them into the bed of his old truck. The journey back to the mill took only minutes, but each second felt like an eternity as he thought of those desperate creatures waiting. When he returned, Goliath was still standing guard, but Thomas could see the exhaustion in every line of the great horse's body. How long had he been standing vigil? How many days had he gone without proper food or water, while ensuring the foals stayed together and safe? Thomas carried the buckets inside one by one, placing them carefully around the mill's interior. The foals approached cautiously at first, but once one brave soul dipped its muzzle into the cool water, the others followed. Soon the mill was filled with the sound of desperate drinking, and Thomas had to return to his truck 3 more times to bring enough water to satisfy their thirst. Goliath drank last, only after every foal had drunk its fill. Thomas watched this with a mixture of awe and heartbreak. This magnificent creature, clearly suffering from his own deprivation, had put the needs of these orphaned foals above his own survival. It was an act of such pure nobility that Thomas felt his eyes sting with fresh tears. He had worked with animals his entire life, but he had never witnessed anything quite like this. Goliath was not their father by blood, yet he had claimed them as his own, with a devotion that surpassed mere instinct. After water came the challenge of food. Thomas's farm had hay, enough for his small flock of sheep and the 2 dairy cows he kept. But feeding 26 horses would deplete his winter stores within days. He looked through the saddlebag again and found the envelope Catherine had mentioned. Inside were several bills, perhaps $300 in total. It was something, but it wouldn't last long. Thomas did quick mental calculations as he drove back to his farm to load hay bales into his truck. At current prices, he was looking at hundreds of dollars per week just in feed costs, and that was before considering veterinary care, which these animals desperately needed. But those were problems for later. Right now, he had hungry horses to feed. Thomas made trip after trip, hauling hay bales from his barn to the mill. His back ached and his arms trembled from the effort. But he didn't stop until he had created a substantial pile in the corner of the mill. He broke the bales apart, spreading the hay so that all the foals could eat without fighting over space. Goliath waited again, watching as the foals tore into the food with desperate hunger. Only when they had settled into eating did the great horse approach the hay himself, taking calm, measured bites as though he had all the time in the world. As Thomas watched them eat, he began to truly see the individual foals for the first time. They were a mix of breeds and colors, clearly from different mothers. Some were sturdy and thick-legged like Goliath, obviously draft horse foals that would grow to be working animals. Others were more delicate, with the refined features of riding breeds. A few were somewhere in between, the result of crosses that created unique and beautiful animals. Catherine had collected them all, these unwanted babies, and Goliath had protected them all without discrimination. Thomas counted them again to be sure. 25 foals, ranging in age from perhaps 2 months to 6 months old. None of them were old enough to be weaned properly, and Thomas felt his stomach drop as he realized what that meant. They would need special nutrition, supplements, careful monitoring. Several of them showed signs of illness beyond simple malnutrition. One small bay filly stood apart from the others, her breathing labored and her head hanging low. Another, a gray colt with a crooked star on his forehead, had a swelling on his front leg that needed immediate attention. Thomas pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. He should call his veterinarian, Sarah Chen, who had been treating his animals for 15 years. But Sarah was also his friend, and he knew what she would say when she saw this situation. She would tell him the practical truth that he was trying to ignore. These horses needed more than one farmer could provide. They needed a rescue organization with resources and staff. They needed people who specialized in rehabilitation and placement. They needed more than Thomas Harrington could give them alone. But as he stood there with his phone in his hand, Goliath walked over to him. The giant horse had finished eating and now stood beside Thomas, close enough that the farmer could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body. Goliath lowered his head and rested it gently against Thomas's shoulder, a gesture so trusting and gentle that it made Thomas's throat close with emotion. This horse had been betrayed by circumstances beyond his control. Catherine had tried her best and failed. The world had turned its back on these creatures, deciding they were too much trouble, too expensive, too difficult to save. Thomas put his phone away and placed both hands on Goliath's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the skin, the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. He thought of Catherine, dying alone with her final hopes pinned on the kindness of a stranger. He thought of the 3 weeks these animals had spent in this mill, surviving on whatever water they could find, with Goliath keeping them together through sheer force of will. He thought of his own comfortable life, his quiet routine, his careful budgets and planned expenses. Then he made his decision. He would call Sarah, but not to ask her to take them away. He would call her to help him save them. Sarah Chen arrived within the hour, her veterinary truck kicking up dust as it pulled up to the old mill. Thomas had known her long enough to read the concern on her face before she even stepped out of the vehicle. She was a woman in her early 40s, efficient and practical, with kind eyes that had seen countless animals through illness and injury. When Thomas had called her, he had simply said he needed her help with an emergency situation involving horses. He hadn't mentioned how many horses or the condition they were in, knowing she might refuse to come if she understood the full scope of what awaited her. Sarah's expression changed the moment she stepped through the mill door. Her professional composure faltered as she took in the scene before her, the massive Shire standing protectively over 24 foals in various states of distress, the makeshift feeding area Thomas had created, the evidence of prolonged neglect written on every thin body and dull coat. "Thomas," she said slowly, her voice carefully controlled, "what have you gotten yourself into?" He handed her Catherine's letter without a word, watching her face as she read. When she finished, Sarah folded the letter carefully and returned it to him, then stood in silence for a long moment. The veterinarian set down her bag and approached Goliath first, moving with the calm confidence of someone who had worked with horses her entire professional life. But even she seemed awed by the sheer size and presence of the Shire. She ran her hands over his body, checking his condition with practiced efficiency. Thomas watched as her expression grew increasingly grave. Goliath was severely underweight, his ribs visible beneath his shaggy coat. His hooves desperately needed trimming, overgrown to the point where they had probably caused him pain with every step. There were old cuts and scrapes on his legs, evidence of the difficult journey Catherine had led him on before her death. "He should be dead," Sarah said quietly, still examining Goliath. 3 weeks without adequate food or water, the stress of protecting all these foals, the condition he was already in before arriving here. "Thomas, this horse should have given up and laid down to die, but he didn't." Thomas moved to stand beside her, placing his hand on Goliath's shoulder. "He couldn't," Thomas replied. "He's all they have." Sarah looked at the foals, then back at Goliath, and Thomas saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She was beginning to see what he had seen, the extraordinary nature of this animal's devotion. Sarah spent the next 3 hours examining every horse. She worked methodically, starting with the foals that appeared most ill and working her way through each one. Thomas assisted her, holding nervous animals still while she listened to their hearts and lungs, checked their temperatures, examined their eyes and mouths. The news was not good. Several foals had respiratory infections that would require antibiotics. Most were anemic and would need iron supplements. All of them were severely malnourished and infested with parasites. The bay filly Thomas had noticed earlier had pneumonia, and Sarah's face was grim as she administered emergency medication. The gray colt with the swollen leg had an abscess that needed to be lanced and drained immediately. Sarah prepared her instruments while Thomas held the young horse steady, speaking softly to him as the veterinarian worked. The colt trembled but didn't fight, as though he understood they were trying to help. When Sarah finished, she bandaged the leg carefully and gave Thomas detailed instructions for follow-up care. "This one will need daily treatment for at least 2 weeks," she said. "The infection is deep." Thomas nodded, adding it to the growing mental list of tasks that would now fill his days. When Sarah had examined all 26 horses, she sat down heavily on an old wooden crate, her notebook filled with pages of observations and treatment plans. Thomas sat beside her, waiting for the verdict he knew was coming. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft sounds of the horses eating and moving around the mill. Finally, Sarah turned to look at him, her expression a mixture of compassion and concern. "Thomas, I'm going to be honest with you because we've been friends too long for anything else. What you're taking on here is beyond what one person can manage." She flipped through her notes, showing him the extensive list of medical needs. Immediate costs alone would run into thousands of dollars for medications, supplements, and follow-up visits. That didn't include feed, which would cost several $100s per week, or the inevitable emergency treatments some of these foals would need. Then there was the question of space. 26 horses couldn't stay in this mill indefinitely. They would need proper shelter, secure fencing, pasture for grazing. The infrastructure requirements alone would cost tens of thousands of dollars that Thomas didn't have. Sarah continued outlining the challenges, her voice gentle but firm. The time commitment would be enormous. These foals would need monitoring every few hours, especially the sick ones. Medications would have to be administered multiple times daily. The physical labor of caring for so many animals would be exhausting for a man half Thomas's age, let alone someone in his 50s working alone. And beyond all that was the question of the future. Even if he managed to nurse them all back to health, what then? 26 horses that needed permanent homes in a world that hadn't wanted them in the first place. Thomas listened to everything Sarah said, his heart growing heavier with each word. She wasn't telling him anything he hadn't already thought of during the hours he'd spent hauling water and hay. But hearing it laid out so clearly, so professionally, made the impossibility of his situation undeniable. Sarah put her hand on his arm. "I can help you contact some rescue organizations, good ones that specialize in draft horses and rehabilitation. They have the facilities and the staff to handle this. It's not giving up, Thomas. It's being realistic about what these animals need." Thomas looked across the mill to where Goliath stood among the foals, his massive head lowered as several of the younger ones nuzzled against him, seeking comfort. The giant horse's eyes met Thomas's across the distance, and in that moment, Thomas felt the weight of a promise he couldn't break. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know you're right. I know this is too much for one person, but I'm going to try anyway." He turned to face her, seeing the protest forming on her lips. "I need your help. Not to take them away, but to save them. Here, with me." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "You're as stubborn as that horse," she said, but there was affection in her voice. "All right, but we do this properly." The first week was the hardest of Thomas's life. Sarah had left him with boxes of medications, detailed schedules, and warnings about what symptoms to watch for that might indicate a horse was declining. She had also left him with a bill that made his hands shake when he opened it, but she had scrawled across the bottom that he could pay her whenever he was able. Some debts, she had told him as she climbed into her truck that first day, aren't about money. This is one of them. Take care of them, Thomas, and take care of yourself. Thomas had converted his entire life into a schedule built around the horses. He woke at 4 a.m, before the sun rose, and made his way to the mill with thermoses of coffee that were never quite enough to keep him alert. His first task was always checking on the sickest foals. The bay filly with pneumonia, whom he had started calling Rosie for the pink tinge to her nose, required medication every 6 hours. Thomas had set alarms on his phone that woke him throughout the night, and he stumbled through the darkness to the mill more times than he could count, driven by the fear that he might arrive to find her lifeless body among the hay. But Rosie fought. Every morning when Thomas arrived, she was still breathing, still struggling to overcome the infection that ravaged her small body. He would sit beside her in the early morning darkness, one hand on her neck, feeling the heat of fever beneath her coat, and he would talk to her, tell her about the spring that would come, about the green pastures she would run through when she was well, about the life that waited for her if she could just hold on a little longer. Sometimes he wondered if he was really talking to Rosie or to himself, trying to convince them both that this impossible task was worth the sacrifice. Goliath had become Thomas's partner in ways he never could have anticipated. The giant horse seemed to understand what Thomas was trying to do, and he helped in every way his equine nature allowed. When Thomas needed to treat a frightened foal, Goliath would position his massive body to block the youngster's escape, creating a living wall that kept them contained without force. When Thomas was exhausted, sitting on the mill floor with his back against a wall, Goliath would come to stand beside him, a silent presence that somehow made the burden feel lighter. Thomas had learned to read Goliath's signals. A particular whinny meant one of the foals was in distress. A pawing at the ground indicated water buckets needed refilling. The way Goliath positioned himself among the foals showed Thomas which ones needed extra attention. It was as though the horse had appointed himself supervisor of this rescue operation, and Thomas was merely the human assistant following orders. The thought made Thomas smile even in his darkest moments of exhaustion. The logistics of caring for 26 horses were staggering. Thomas had calculated that he was hauling nearly 300 gallons of water to the mill each day. His truck made so many trips between his farm and the mill that he knew every bump in the road by feel. The hay consumption was equally overwhelming. His winter stores, carefully accumulated to feed his small flock through the cold months, were disappearing at an alarming rate. He had already made 2 emergency purchases from the feed store in town, each one depleting his savings account further. The owner of the feed store, an elderly man named Walter who had known Thomas since childhood, had raised his eyebrows when Thomas loaded his truck with 10 times his usual order. "Heard you've got some horses now," Walter had said carefully, in the way small-town people broach subjects they were curious about but too polite to ask directly. Thomas had simply nodded, too tired to explain. Word was already spreading through the community. A farmer didn't suddenly start buying massive quantities of horse feed without people noticing. By the end of the first week, Thomas had lost 12 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He was running on coffee, determination, and something that felt like prayer, though Thomas wasn't sure he believed in prayer anymore. But in the quiet moments before dawn, sitting in the mill with Goliath standing guard and the foals sleeping in scattered groups across the floor, Thomas found himself whispering requests to whatever force might be listening. Let them live. Just let them live. The physical exhaustion was brutal, but it was the financial reality that kept Thomas awake at night. He had gone through Catherine's $300 in 3 days. His savings account, never large, was shrinking at an alarming rate. He had done the calculations over and over, trying to find a way to make the numbers work, but mathematics was indifferent to good intentions. At his current rate of spending, he had perhaps 6 weeks before he ran out of money entirely. 6 weeks to find a miracle, or 6 weeks until he would be forced to make the call he was dreading, admitting defeat and asking Sarah to help him find other homes for the horses. But then, on the 7th day, something changed. Thomas arrived at the mill in the pre-dawn darkness to find Rosie standing on her own. She was still thin, still weak, but she was up. Her eyes, which had been glazed with fever for days, were clear and bright. When Thomas approached her, she nickered softly and nuzzled his hand, looking for treats he didn't have. Thomas sank to his knees in the hay, his chest tight with emotion. One horse, one small victory in a war he was probably going to lose. But in that moment, it felt like everything. Goliath walked over to where Thomas knelt and lowered his great head to rest it on Thomas's shoulder. The gesture had become familiar over the past week, this gentle contact that seemed to say they were in this together. Thomas reached up to stroke the white blaze on Goliath's face, feeling the warmth of the horse's breath on his neck. "I don't know how we're going to do this," he whispered to the giant horse. "I don't know how I'm going to afford to keep feeding you all. I don't know how I'm going to get through the next 6 weeks, let alone the next 6 months." Goliath made a low sound in his chest, something between a rumble and a sigh. In the growing light of dawn, Thomas could see his own exhaustion reflected in the horse's eyes. They were both tired. They were both carrying burdens too heavy for any single creature to bear, but they were carrying them anyway, because the alternative was unthinkable. Thomas stood slowly, his joints protesting after another mostly sleepless night. "All right, big guy," he said to Goliath, "let's get everyone fed. Another day, another chance." The transformation happened so gradually that Thomas almost didn't notice it at first. Small things, like the delivery truck that appeared at his farm one morning with 6 bales of hay. The driver, a young man Thomas didn't recognize, simply unloaded them near his barn and handed him a slip of paper. "Says here it's paid for," the driver said with a shrug. "Someone called it in anonymous." Thomas stood holding the delivery receipt, staring at it as though it might explain itself. But the driver was already climbing back into his truck and rumbling away down the dirt road. 2 days later, Thomas found a box of veterinary supplies on his porch. Antibiotics, wound dressings, vitamin supplements, all things Sarah had prescribed for the horses. There was no note, no indication of who had left them. Just the supplies sitting there in the morning mist like an offering to unseen gods. Thomas carried the box inside with trembling hands, calculating its value in his head. Hundreds of dollars worth of medications he had been dreading having to purchase. He sat at his kitchen table and allowed himself to cry for the first time since finding the horses, overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers. The truth was, small towns had long memories and even longer networks of gossip. Walter from the feed store had mentioned Thomas's situation to his wife, who had mentioned it to her sister, who sang in the church choir with 3 other women who between them knew half the county. Sarah had spoken to a colleague who had spoken to a rescue organization volunteer who had posted about it on social media. Within days, the story of the giant horse and his family of orphaned foals had spread through the community, like ripples on a pond. Thomas discovered this one afternoon when he returned from the mill to find his driveway full of cars. For a terrified moment, he thought something had happened, some emergency that had brought people to his door. But as he climbed out of his truck, he saw they were smiling. There were perhaps a dozen people, some he knew and some he didn't, and they all stood in his yard holding various items. Mrs. Patterson from the church had brought casseroles, enough food to feed Thomas for a week. The Kowalski brothers, who ran a construction company, had come with lumber and tools. Emma Rodriguez, who taught at the local elementary school, had organized her students to make a collection jar that had raised $200. "We heard you could use some help," Mrs. Patterson said simply, and Thomas found he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. The Kowalski brothers explained that they wanted to help him repair the mill to make it weatherproof and safe for winter. Emma handed him the collection jar with a smile, telling him how her students had been drawing pictures of Goliath and the foals, creating stories about their rescue. "The children are calling him the guardian giant," she told Thomas. "They want to help save him." Over the next week, Thomas's property transformed. The Kowalski brothers returned every evening after their regular work, bringing friends and supplies. They patched the holes in the mill's roof, replaced broken windows with clear plastic sheeting, and reinforced the doors. They built proper water troughs from salvaged materials and installed a temporary fence to create a safe paddock where the horses could eventually graze. Other community members contributed according to their abilities. Someone donated blankets for the horses. Someone else brought tools Thomas needed. A local farrier offered to trim Goliath's overgrown hooves for free. a service that normally cost hundreds of dollars. The farrier, a weathered woman named Margaret who had been working with horses for 40 years, spent an entire afternoon with Goliath. Thomas watched as she worked, marveling at the patience required to trim the hooves of an 18-hand Shire. Margaret spoke to Goliath constantly, her voice low and soothing, explaining each step as though the horse could understand. And perhaps he could, because Goliath stood perfectly still, even when the work must have been uncomfortable, even when Margaret had to use heavy tools to cut through neglected hoof material that had grown thick and cracked. When she finished, Margaret stood back to admire her work, then turned to Thomas with serious eyes. "This horse," she said quietly, "is something special. I've worked with hundreds of horses in my career, but I've never seen one with this kind of heart. You know what he did while I was working? Every few minutes he would turn his head to check on the foals, making sure they were all accounted for, all safe. Never mind that I was holding his foot, that he was balanced on 3 legs. His first concern was always them." Thomas had noticed it too. Goliath's devotion to the foals never wavered. Even as his own condition improved with regular food and care, even as his ribs became less prominent and his coat began to shine, his focus remained on his charges. He would eat only after confirming all the foals had food. He would drink only after they had drunk. At night, he positioned himself strategically so that he could see the entire mill, able to respond if any foal cried out in distress. It was a level of responsibility that seemed impossible for an animal to maintain, and yet Goliath maintained it without fail. The foals themselves were responding to the improved care. Most of the respiratory infections had cleared up. The gray colt's leg wound was healing well, the swelling reduced to almost nothing. Even little Rosie, who had been so close to death, was now playing with the other foals, her energy returning day by day. Thomas had started naming them all, finding it easier to track their individual needs when he could call them by name instead of describing them by color and markings. There was Scout, a curious chestnut colt who was always first to investigate anything new. There was Pepper, a dappled gray filly with a spicy personality. There was Gentle Ben, a massive foal who would clearly grow to rival Goliath's size, but who had the sweetest temperament Thomas had ever seen. But even with the community's help, Thomas's financial situation remained precarious. The donations and volunteer labor had bought him time, but the daily costs of feeding 26 horses were relentless. His savings account was down to 3 digits, a number that made his chest tighten with anxiety every time he checked it. He had started skipping meals himself, telling himself he wasn't really hungry, that the coffee was enough to keep him going. Sarah had noticed his weight loss and scolded him, but Thomas just shrugged it off. The horses needed to eat. He could eat less. One evening, as Thomas sat in the mill watching the foals settle down for the night, Emma Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. She had visited several times since that first day, often bringing food or supplies, but this time she carried a laptop computer. "Thomas," she said, sitting down beside him on a hay bale, "I have an idea." She opened the laptop and turned it toward him, showing him a website. "It's called crowdfunding," she explained. "People share stories online, and others can donate money to help. I think your story, Goliath's story, deserves to be heard by more than just our little community." Thomas stared at the screen, uncertain. He had never been comfortable asking for help, had been raised to believe that a man solved his own problems. But as he looked at the foals sleeping peacefully around Goliath's massive form, he realized this wasn't about his pride anymore. This was about survival, about giving these innocent creatures the chance they deserved. Emma saw his hesitation and put her hand on his arm. "Let me help you with this," she said gently. "Let the world see what you're doing here. You'd be surprised how many people want to be part of something good." That night, Thomas lay in his bed and thought about Emma's offer. The idea of sharing his story with strangers felt uncomfortable, almost like an invasion of the private bond he had formed with Goliath and the Foals. But he was also running out of options. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Thomas agreed to Emma's plan the next morning. She arrived at his farm with her laptop and a camera, ready to document the story that had already captured their small community's heart. Thomas felt awkward at first, standing in front of her camera trying to explain how he had found Goliath and the Foals, how Catherine's letter had changed everything. But Emma had a gift for putting people at ease, and soon Thomas found himself speaking from the heart, the words flowing naturally as he talked about the giant horse who had become his partner in this impossible mission. Emma filmed everything. She captured Goliath standing among the foals, his massive presence a study in gentle strength. She filmed Thomas administering medications, his weathered hands steady and sure despite his exhaustion. She recorded the moment when little Rosie, now almost fully recovered, trotted over to Thomas and nuzzled his pocket looking for treats. Most powerfully, she filmed Thomas reading Catherine's letter aloud, his voice breaking slightly as he reached the part where the dying woman had placed her final hopes in the kindness of strangers. The video went online that evening, posted to a crowdfunding platform with a modest goal of $5,000. Emma had written a description that laid out the situation clearly: the medical expenses already incurred, the ongoing costs of feed and care, the dream of eventually finding permanent homes for all the foals while keeping Goliath safe and comfortable for the rest of his life. Thomas went to bed that night trying not to think about it, trying not to hope too much. $5,000 seemed like an impossible amount to raise from strangers on the internet. He woke at 4 in the morning as usual and checked his phone out of habit. There were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Thomas's heart sank, assuming something had gone wrong, that someone was trying to reach him with bad news. But as he scrolled through the messages, he realized they were all about the campaign. Emma had sent him a link with 3 exclamation points. Thomas clicked it with shaking hands, and the number on the screen made him sit down hard on the edge of his bed. $8,000. The campaign had raised $8,000 in less than 12 hours. By the end of that day, the total had climbed to $15,000. By the end of the week, it had surpassed $30,000. The story had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms. News outlets began calling, asking to interview Thomas and film Goliath. The local television station sent a crew that spent an entire afternoon at the mill, capturing footage that would air on the evening news. A regional newspaper featured the story on their front page, with a photograph of Goliath surrounded by foals under the headline, "Guardian Giant Inspires Community." Thomas was overwhelmed by the response. Donations came from all over the country, from people who had been touched by the story of one horse's devotion and one farmer's determination to honor it. They came with messages that Thomas read late at night, sitting in the mill, with his phone casting a soft glow in the darkness. A woman wrote that she had lost her own horse years ago, and this story had reminded her of the bond they had shared. A man donated in memory of his father, who had been a farmer and would have done the same thing Thomas was doing. A child sent $5 with a drawing of Goliath labeled "My Hero." But the attention brought complications Thomas hadn't anticipated. People began showing up at his farm unannounced, wanting to see the famous giant horse and his family. Some were respectful, content to view from a distance and leave donations. Others were less considerate, treating the horses like a tourist attraction, trying to pet the foals despite Thomas's explanations that they were still recovering and needed minimal stress. One man actually climbed over the fence Emma had helped build, determined to get a selfie with Goliath, and Thomas had to physically escort him off the property. Sarah helped Thomas establish boundaries. Together, they created visiting hours on weekends, when people could come see the horses under supervised conditions. They set up a donation box near the mill and created informational signs that explained each horse's story and recovery progress. The Kowalski brothers built a proper viewing platform that allowed visitors to observe the horses without disturbing them. Slowly, the chaos organized itself into something manageable, though Thomas still found the constant attention exhausting. The money from the crowdfunding campaign transformed everything. Thomas was able to purchase 3 months' worth of hay in advance, securing his feed supply through the winter. He hired a local teenager named Marcus to help with daily chores, giving him a few hours each day to rest. He paid Sarah's veterinary bill in full, along with money for future treatments. He even allowed himself a trip to the grocery store where he bought actual food instead of just coffee and bread, though he still felt guilty spending money on himself when it could go to the horses. With financial pressure eased, Thomas could focus on what he did best: caring for animals. The foals flourished under his attention and the improved conditions. They grew stronger each day, their coats brightening, their energy increasing. The mill, now properly weatherproofed and equipped, had become a real stable. The paddock allowed the horses to go outside during mild weather, stretching their legs and feeling grass beneath their hooves. Thomas watched them play together, the foals racing around, while Goliath supervised from the center like a patient father, and felt something close to peace. But Goliath himself remained a mystery in some ways. Despite the excellent care, despite the regular meals and safe shelter, the giant horse never fully relaxed. He was always watching, always vigilant, as though he carried a responsibility that couldn't be set down. Thomas would find him standing guard in the middle of the night, his massive head raised and alert, even when all the foals slept peacefully. It was as if Goliath couldn't allow himself to rest, couldn't trust that his charges were truly safe. One cold November morning, Thomas arrived at the mill to find Goliath standing at the fence line, staring out at the distant hills. The horse's posture was different somehow, almost melancholy. Thomas approached quietly and stood beside him, following his gaze to the horizon. "What are you thinking about, big guy?" Thomas asked softly. "Do you miss her? Do you miss Catherine?" Goliath turned his great head to look at Thomas, and in his dark eyes was an expression of such profound sadness that it made Thomas's chest ache. He understood then that Goliath was grieving. The horse had lost the woman who had trusted him with her final act of hope. He had carried that responsibility alone for weeks, protecting the foals because it was what Catherine had asked of him. And even now, even safe and cared for, Goliath couldn't let go of the duty he had been given. Thomas reached up to stroke the horse's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the thick winter coat. "She would be proud of you," Thomas whispered. "Catherine would be so proud of what you've done. You saved them all." That afternoon, Thomas made a decision. He called a local stonemason and commissioned a memorial stone to be placed near the mill. It would bear Catherine Blackwood's name and dates, along with a simple inscription: "She trusted in kindness, and kindness answered." It seemed important to mark her final act, to ensure that her faith in humanity was remembered alongside the miracle it had created. Winter arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that dropped below freezing and winds that howled through the valley like living things. The mill, despite all the improvements the community had made, still let in drafts through gaps in the ancient stone walls. Thomas spent long hours insulating every crack he could find, hanging heavy tarps and stuffing gaps with straw. The horses needed warmth, and he was determined to provide it no matter how much effort it required. Marcus, the teenager he had hired, proved invaluable during these brutal weeks, showing up faithfully even when the roads were treacherous with ice. The foals had grown considerably since that first desperate day when Thomas had found them. They were no longer the skeletal, frightened creatures that had huddled together for survival. Regular meals and proper care had transformed them into healthy young horses, their coats thick with winter growth, their eyes bright with curiosity and energy. Thomas could hardly believe the change when he looked at them. Scout, the curious chestnut colt, now stood nearly as tall as Thomas's chest and had developed a habit of investigating everything with his nose, often stealing tools right out of Thomas's hands. Pepper, the spicy gray filly, had indeed lived up to her name with a personality that kept Thomas constantly on his toes. But the recovery wasn't complete for all of them. 3 of the foals remained smaller than the others, their growth stunted by the severe malnutrition they had endured. Sarah had warned Thomas that some effects of their early deprivation might be permanent. These 3, whom Thomas had named Hope, Faith, and Charity in a moment of whimsy, would likely never reach the full size of their breed. They would need extra care for the rest of their lives, careful monitoring to ensure they stayed healthy despite their compromised start. Thomas didn't mind. If anything, the 3 small ones had claimed a special place in his heart. They seemed to sense their own vulnerability and stuck close to Goliath, who had extended his protection over them with particular vigilance. Often Thomas would find all 3 of them sleeping pressed against Goliath's massive body, using him as a windbreak and source of warmth. The giant horse never complained, never moved when he might disturb them, simply stood or lay still and let them take what comfort they needed from his presence. It was during one of these harsh winter nights that Thomas received a phone call that would test everything he had built. The voice on the other end was professional and measured, belonging to a woman who introduced herself as Margaret Chen, an attorney from the city. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Attorneys never called with good news, especially not at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Ms. Chen explained that she represented the estate of Catherine Blackwood, and that she had been searching for the horses that had disappeared after Catherine's death. Thomas's hand tightened on the phone. He had Catherine's letter, her explicit transfer of ownership, but he suddenly wondered if that would be enough. What if there were relatives who wanted the horses back? What if someone contested Catherine's right to give away valuable animals? Ms. Chen seemed to sense his panic and quickly reassured him that she wasn't calling to take the horses away. In fact, she explained, she had been Catherine's personal attorney and friend, and she had known about Catherine's desperate plan to save the horses. She had been searching for them for months, hoping they had found safety. What Ms. Chen told Thomas next made him sit down hard in his kitchen chair. Catherine Blackwood's estate, once thought to be completely insolvent, had produced an unexpected asset. A life insurance policy that Catherine had forgotten she owned, taken out years ago and paid in full. The policy had a specific beneficiary clause that Catherine had added in her final days, directing that any remaining funds be used for the care of Goliath and the foals. The amount was substantial, $50,000, designated specifically for their welfare. Thomas couldn't speak for a long moment, his throat too tight with emotion. $50,000 would ensure the horse's care for years. It would allow him to build proper stables, to provide veterinary care without worry, to give each foal the best possible chance at life. Catherine, even in death, was still trying to save them. Ms. Chen continued, explaining that there were conditions. The money had to be used solely for the horses. Thomas would need to provide quarterly reports to the estate, documenting how the funds were spent. If he ever tried to sell any of the horses for profit, the money would be reclaimed. Thomas agreed to every condition without hesitation. He didn't want a profit from these animals. He wanted exactly what Catherine had wanted, for them to live and thrive and find happiness. Ms. Chen promised to have the paperwork drawn up and sent to him within the week. Before she hung up, she said something that stayed with Thomas long after the call ended. "Catherine talked about you, you know. She sat in those hills watching your farm for 2 days before she brought the horses to your mill. She said she saw kindness in you. She said she saw someone who would understand." After the call, Thomas walked out to the mill despite the bitter cold. He needed to see Goliath, needed to tell him somehow that Catherine had found a way to care for them even from beyond the grave. he found the giant horse standing in his usual position, awake and watchful despite the late hour. Thomas approached and wrapped his arms around Goliath's massive neck as far as they would reach. "She's still looking after you," he whispered into the horse's mane. "Catherine's still keeping you safe." The winter deepened, but Thomas no longer faced it with fear. The insurance money meant security, meant the ability to plan for the future rather than simply surviving day to day. He hired contractors to begin work on a proper barn that would house all the horses comfortably, with individual stalls for those who needed special care and a large common area where they could socialize. The Kowalski brothers volunteered their expertise, designing a structure that would be both functional and affordable, maximizing the value of every dollar spent. The community continued to rally around the project. The crowdfunding campaign, though officially ended, still received occasional donations from people who had followed the story and wanted to help. Local businesses donated materials. Volunteers showed up on weekends to help with construction. Thomas's quiet farm had become a hub of activity, a place where people came together for a common purpose. It reminded Thomas of barn raisings from generations past, when neighbors helped neighbors without expectation of reward, simply because it was the right thing to do. But amid all the positive developments, Thomas couldn't shake a growing concern about Goliath. The giant horse, despite improved conditions and excellent care, seemed to be fading. Not physically, his body was actually in the best condition it had been since Thomas had found him. But there was a weariness in Goliath's eyes that troubled Thomas deeply. The horse still stood guard over the foals, still maintained his vigilant watch, but something essential seemed to be draining out of him day by day. Sarah noticed it too when she came for a routine check. The veterinarian examined Goliath thoroughly, but could find nothing medically wrong. His heart was strong, his lungs clear, his blood work normal. Physically, he was a healthy horse in his prime. But Sarah and Thomas both knew that health wasn't only about the body. "I think he's tired, Thomas," Sarah said quietly as they stood watching Goliath. "He's carried this responsibility for so long. Maybe he doesn't know how to let it go." Thomas understood what she meant. Goliath had been given a mission by Catherine, a sacred trust to protect these foals. He had fulfilled that mission beyond all reasonable expectation, but the cost had been high, and perhaps some costs couldn't be repaid simply with food and shelter and safety. Thomas decided something had to change. Goliath had been a guardian for too long, had carried the weight of responsibility without rest. It was time to help him understand that he could let go, that the foals were safe now, that his mission was complete. But how did you communicate such a thing to a horse, even one as intelligent and aware as Goliath? Thomas spent long nights thinking about it, watching the giant horse stand sentinel while the foals slept peacefully, protected but perhaps also imprisoned by that unwavering devotion. The answer came unexpectedly through Marcus, the teenager who had become indispensable to the farm's operation. Marcus had grown up around horses and had a natural gift for understanding them. One afternoon, as they worked together filling water troughs, Marcus made an observation that shifted Thomas's entire perspective. "You know what I think?" Marcus said, leaning on his shovel. "I think Goliath doesn't believe they're really safe. He's been let down before. Catherine promised him a home and then she died. He ended up alone in that mill with all these babies depending on him. Maybe he's just waiting for it to fall apart again." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Of course. Goliath had learned through trauma that safety was temporary, that the ground could shift without warning. No amount of food or shelter would convince him otherwise. He needed proof that wouldn't disappear. He needed to see the foals thriving, not just surviving. He needed to witness them moving forward into lives that no longer required his constant vigilance. Thomas realized then what he had to do, even though the thought of it made his chest ache with impending loss. The new barn was completed in early March, just as the first hints of spring began to warm the frozen ground. It was a beautiful structure, far nicer than anything Thomas had imagined being able to afford. The Kowalski brothers had outdone themselves, creating a space that was both practical and comfortable, with good ventilation, plenty of natural light, and enough room for all the horses to move freely. The day they moved, everyone from the mill to the barn was a celebration, with half the town showing up to help and witness the transition. But Thomas knew the barn was only the first step. The foals, now nearly a year old, were ready for the next phase of their lives. They needed individual attention, specialized training, and eventually permanent homes. Thomas had been contacted by dozens of people interested in adopting the horses, but he had put off making any decisions, unable to face the reality of separation. Now, with Marcus's words echoing in his mind, he understood that keeping them all together wasn't helping Goliath release his burden. It was reinforcing it, telling him that his job was never finished. Thomas reached out to the horse rescue organization that Sarah had originally suggested. They came to evaluate the foals, and their assessment was overwhelmingly positive. Thanks to Thomas's care, these once desperate orphans were now healthy, well-socialized young horses with excellent temperaments. The rescue coordinator, a woman named Diana with 30 years of experience, was particularly impressed by their trust in humans despite their traumatic start. "That's your doing," she told Thomas. "You didn't just save their bodies, you saved their spirits." Diana helped Thomas develop a placement plan. They would start slowly, finding homes for the foals who were most ready to move on. Each adoption would be carefully screened, with contracts ensuring the horses would receive lifelong care. Thomas would maintain visitation rights and could reclaim any horse if the placement didn't work out. It was as safe as he could make it, but it still felt like tearing pieces from his own heart as he prepared to say goodbye. The first to leave was Scout, the curious chestnut colt who had grown into a magnificent young horse. His new home was with a therapeutic riding program that worked with children with disabilities. Diana explained that Scout's gentle curiosity made him perfect for the work, and the program's director had been moved to tears when meeting him. On the day Scout left, Thomas led him up the ramp into the trailer himself, taking time to explain to the young horse that he was going somewhere wonderful, somewhere he would be loved and valued. What surprised Thomas was Goliath's reaction. The giant horse watched Scout leave with his usual careful attention, but there was something different in his posture. When the trailer pulled away and Scout whinnied from inside, Goliath answered with a deep, resonant call that seemed to carry both farewell and blessing. And then he turned and walked calmly back to the other foals, settling among them with what looked almost like relief. Thomas stood stunned, realizing that Goliath understood. The horse knew that Scout was going to a good place, not being abandoned, and somehow that knowledge had eased something in him. Over the next 2 months, more foals found their perfect homes. Pepper went to a dressage trainer who saw championship potential in her spirited nature. Gentle Ben joined a draft horse sanctuary where he would live out his life pulling wagons for visitors and teaching people about the gentle giants of the horse world. Rosie, the little bay filly who had nearly died of pneumonia, was adopted by a retired veterinarian who wanted a companion for her own aging horse. Each departure was emotional for Thomas, but each time he saw Goliath's calm acceptance, he knew he was doing the right thing. The 3 smallest foals, Hope, Faith, and Charity, would stay with Thomas permanently. Their special needs made outside placement risky, and Thomas had grown so attached to them that he couldn't imagine life without them. The rescue organization agreed this was the best solution, and Thomas legally adopted them, making them permanent residents of his farm. He liked having them there, these little reminders of how far they had all come. And he thought Catherine would approve of their names and their place in his life. By late spring, only 8 foals remained in addition to the 3 permanent residents. These were the ones who needed more time, more training, or who were waiting for just the right homes. Thomas was patient. He had learned that forcing timelines helped no one. Each horse would leave when they were ready and when the perfect situation presented itself. The barn felt emptier now, but it also felt calmer. There was room to breathe, room to move, room for the remaining horses to develop their individual personalities without the constant press of numbers. And Goliath, remarkably, was transforming. The weariness that had worried Thomas was lifting day by day. The giant horse still watched over his remaining charges, but his vigilance had softened into something more like mentorship than desperate protection. He spent time in the pasture now, grazing peacefully, sometimes even lying down to sleep in the sunshine. Thomas caught him playing one afternoon, trotting around the paddock with a young colt chasing him, both of them seeming to enjoy the simple pleasure of movement without purpose. It was the first time Thomas had seen Goliath truly play, and the sight made him laugh with pure joy. The memorial stone was delivered on a perfect spring morning when the hills were covered in wildflowers and the air smelled of growth and renewal. The stonemason had carved Catherine's name with care, the letters deep and clear so they would last for generations. Thomas had chosen a spot near the barn, visible from the pasture where the horses grazed, a place where Catherine's memory would be part of the daily life she had worked so hard to preserve. The inscription read exactly as Thomas had requested: Catherine Blackwood, who trusted in kindness, and kindness answered. Beneath it was a simple carving of a horse, its head bowed in eternal rest. Thomas organized a small ceremony for the unveiling, inviting everyone who had played a part in the rescue. Sarah came along with Emma and the Kowalski brothers. Mrs. Patterson brought her church group. Marcus stood with his family, proud of his role in the ongoing care of the horses. Walter from the feed store was there, as was Margaret the farrier. Diana from the rescue organization attended, bringing updates on the adopted foals. All of them had been touched by this story, had become part of something larger than themselves. They gathered in a semicircle around the covered stone while Thomas prepared to speak, but before Thomas could say a word, Goliath approached from the pasture. The giant horse walked with purpose toward the gathering, his massive hooves making soft thuds on the spring grass. The crowd parted instinctively, giving him room, and Goliath walked directly to the covered memorial stone. He stopped before it and lowered his great head, standing absolutely still, as though paying his own respects to the woman who had entrusted him with her final hope. The silence was profound. Everyone present felt they were witnessing something sacred, a moment of recognition that transcended the boundaries between species. Thomas stepped forward and pulled the cloth from the stone, revealing Catherine's name to the sunlight. As he did, Goliath made a sound Thomas had never heard from him before, a low, mournful call that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. It was the sound of grief acknowledged, of a burden finally shared. Thomas placed his hand on the stone, then on Goliath's shoulder, and spoke the words he had prepared. Catherine Blackwood made an impossible choice in her final days, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet assembly. She chose to trust a stranger with the lives she valued most. She chose hope over despair. And because of that choice, 26 horses lived who might have died. Because of that choice, I learned that one person's kindness can ripple outward in ways they never imagine. Emma stepped forward with a folder containing updates on every adopted foal. She read them aloud, sharing how Scout was thriving in the therapeutic riding program, bringing joy to children who needed it most. How Pepper had won her first dressage competition, her fiery spirit channeled into excellence. How Gentle Ben was beloved at the sanctuary, gentle with every visitor who came to meet him. How Rosie galloped through her new pastures with the kind of energy that only the truly healthy possess. Each story was a testament to survival, to second chances, to the power of not giving up. Thomas watched Goliath as Emma read, and he saw the tension that had defined the giant horse for so long finally completely release. Goliath's head came up, his ears forward, and his eyes held a brightness that spoke of peace. In that moment, Thomas understood that Goliath had needed this ceremony as much as any human present. He had needed to know that Catherine's sacrifice was remembered, that his faithfulness had meaning, that the foals he had guarded so desperately were not just surviving, but flourishing in the world she had hoped to give them. After the ceremony, people lingered to visit with the remaining horses. Hope, faith, and charity trotted over to greet familiar faces, accepting treats and attention with the confidence of horses who knew they were loved. The 8 temporary residents grazed peacefully, awaiting their own perfect placements. And Goliath stood by the memorial stone for a long time, as though keeping Catherine company one last time, before finally walking back to join Thomas at the fence line. That evening, after everyone had left and the farm had returned to its peaceful routine, Thomas sat on the fence watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Goliath came to stand beside him, and Thomas reached out to rest his hand on the horse's shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 souls who had found each other through tragedy and had created something beautiful from it. Thomas thought about the morning he had walked to the old mill, drawn by sounds he didn't understand. He thought about the desperate scene that had greeted him, the impossible choice he had made to take on a burden far too heavy for one person to carry. But it hadn't been too heavy after all, because he hadn't carried it alone. Goliath had carried it with him, and so had Sarah and Marcus and Emma and everyone in the community who had stepped forward to help. Catherine had been right to trust in kindness. Kindness had answered, but not in the way any of them could have predicted. It had multiplied, spreading from person to person, creating a network of care that had saved not just horses, but had restored something precious in every human heart it touched. Thomas looked at Goliath and saw not the exhausted, desperate guardian from that first day, but a horse at peace, a horse who had fulfilled a sacred trust and could now rest, a horse who had learned that some endings are really beginnings, that letting go isn't betrayal but love in its purest form. The giant horse who had carried 25 foals through their darkest hours could finally carry just himself, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, Thomas climbed down from the fence. "Come on, big guy," he said softly to Goliath. "Let's go home." And together, the farmer and the guardian giant walked toward the barn, their shadows long in the fading light, their bond unbreakable, their story one that would be told for generations. A story of trust, of sacrifice, of kindness answered. A story of how one woman's desperate hope and one horse's unwavering devotion had changed a community and proven that even in the darkest moments, there is always light if you know where to look for it. Catherine Blackwood had looked for it in a stranger's kindness. Thomas Harrington had found it in a giant horse's eyes, and together, separated by death but united in purpose, they had created a miracle that would endure long after all of them were gone.